Something happened in 2017 that had never happened before in the entire history of powered flight. Not once since the Wright brothers left the ground at Kitty Hawk in 1903, not through 2 world wars, not through the jet age, the space race, or the rise of budget airlines putting millions of people in the sky every single day. For 1 full year, 365 days, not a single passenger on a commercial jet airliner died in an accident. 0. Nobody. And when that number was announced on January 2, 2018, the world didn't quite know what to do with it. Some people didn't believe it. Some people gave credit to a president. Some experts said, quietly, that it was almost too good to be true, that the numbers rested on a knife's edge, and that one bad day could have shattered everything. But here's the part nobody talks about. This didn't happen by accident. This happened because of accident. One specific accident. In Buffalo, New York, on a freezing night in February 2009. And before we get to that night, we need to understand just how unthinkable what happened in 2017 actually was. Let's put this in perspective, because the numbers are genuinely hard to wrap your head around. In 2017, there were roughly 36.8 million commercial flights worldwide. That's about 100,000 flights every single day, planes taking off and landing, all day, all night, through thunderstorms and fog and mountains and crosswinds. The aviation consulting firm TOW 70 calculated that across all of those millions of flights, the fatal accident rate for large commercial passenger jets was 0.06 per million. 1 accident for every 16 million flights. And yet, 0 deaths. The Aviation Safety Network, the Dutch organization that tracks every crash, every incident, every hull loss going back decades, called it the safest year ever, both by the number of fatal accidents as well as in terms of fatalities. But here's the thing. If you'd told someone in the early 1970s that this would one day be possible, they would have laughed at you. 1972 was the worst year in aviation history by deaths. In that single year, around 2,373 people were killed in airline crashes worldwide. There were 72 separate hull losses, meaning 72 planes that would never fly again. Barely a week into that year, a Spanish airliner flew straight into a mountainside. The crew had been chatting with air traffic control about football. The piston-driven aircraft that dominated airline fleets in 1960 had an accident rate of 27.2 accidents per million departures. 27. By the early 2000s, the current generation of jets had brought that down to 1.5 per million, a reduction of roughly 95%. But reducing is not the same as eliminating. Getting to 0, that required something different. That required learning from the worst failures in the most brutal way possible. So what changed? There's a name you've probably never heard. Don Bateman. In 1972, that same catastrophic year, a Canadian engineer working at Honeywell had an idea. He was watching planes fly perfectly well, with no mechanical failure, with competent pilots, and then simply fly into mountains. It was called Controlled Flight into Terrain, or CFIT. The plane was fine. The crew had no idea they were about to hit the ground. Bateman invented the Ground Proximity Warning System, a device that monitored altitude and descent rate and screamed at the pilot when the terrain was getting too close too fast. The FAA mandated it in 1974. The Flight Safety Foundation's Bill Voss later said Bateman had probably saved more lives than any single person in the history of aviation. You've almost certainly never heard of him. But because of him, CFIT, once one of aviation's biggest killers, is now essentially eliminated in commercial operations. Then came TCAS, the Traffic Collision Avoidance System. On August 31, 1986, a private Piper Archer strayed into controlled airspace near Los Angeles and collided with Aeromexico Flight 498, a DC-9 carrying 58 passengers and crew. Both planes came apart over the Los Angeles suburb of Cerritos. 82 people died. 64 on the DC-9, 3 on the Piper, and 15 people on the ground whose homes the wreckage hit. Neither pilot ever saw the other aircraft coming. In the years following that disaster, the FAA required all commercial jets to be equipped with TCAS. The system doesn't ask the pilot what to do. It calculates the geometry of both aircraft in real time and issues direct commands. Climb, descend, now. Between 1970 and today, global jet traffic increased by a factor of 8, and the risk of mid-air collisions dropped by a factor of nearly 100. Think about that. 8 times more planes in the sky. 1/100th the collision risk. And then there's the black box, which isn't black, it's actually bright orange, so it's easier to find in wreckage. After every single crash, investigators pry that box open and ask, what happened? Why? What do we fix? Every accident became a lesson. Every lesson got written into regulation. The plane you board tomorrow is carrying the hard-won knowledge of every disaster that came before it. But even with all of this, the warning systems, the collision avoidance, the data recorders, something was still going wrong, because technology can't fix a human being who is exhausted, undertrained, or simply not prepared for what the aircraft is telling them. That's where Buffalo comes in. It was February 12, 2009. A Bombardier Dash 8 Q400 turboprop was on approach to Buffalo Niagara International Airport. It was operating as Continental Connection Flight 3407, carrying 45 passengers and a crew of 4. The weather was bad, ice was forming on the wings, and in the cockpit, the 2 pilots were doing something they absolutely weren't supposed to be doing during a critical phase of flight. They were chatting. Casually. The kind of conversation you have when you're comfortable, when you're not quite paying enough attention to what the instruments are telling you. The aircraft slowed down. The airspeed dropped toward a critical threshold. The instruments warned them. And when the plane began to stall, the captain did the opposite of what his training required. He pulled back on the controls instead of pushing forward. The plane rolled, pitched nose down, and fell into a house in the suburb of Clarence Center, New York. 49 people on board died. 1 person in the house died too. 50 total. It was the deadliest U.S. commercial airline crash in nearly a decade. But this one broke something open. When the NTSB investigation dug into the details, what they found was not a freak accident. It was a system failure hiding in plain sight. Captain Marvin Renslow had failed 5 check rides in his career, 3 before joining Colgan Air, and 2 more while at the airline. He had disclosed only one of those failures on his job application. Colgan Air had no way of knowing the rest, because there was no comprehensive federal database of pilot training records. The NTSB found that Renslow had essentially walked through a gap in the system, a gap wide enough to let a pilot with a deeply troubled training history sit in the left seat of a commercial aircraft. First Officer Rebecca Shaw had never failed a check ride. By any individual metric, she appeared qualified. But she was 24 years old, earning approximately $16,000 a year, so little that she was living with her parents near Seattle and commuting overnight to Newark just to get to work. The night before the crash, she flew from Seattle to Memphis to Newark as a passenger and likely slept in the crew room before her shift. The NTSB would later describe the commuting culture at regional airlines as a contributing factor in crew fatigue. Given what we know about sleep deprivation and cognitive performance, it's reasonable to infer that both pilots were operating well below their best. The nation was outraged. Families of the victims didn't grieve quietly. They flew to Washington. They sat in congressional hearings. They made documentaries. They picketed. And they didn't stop. In 2010, Congress passed the Airline Safety and FAA Extension Act, one of the most sweeping aviation safety reforms in American history. It required pilots flying commercial airliners to hold an airline transport pilot certificate, meaning 1,500 hours of flight time, up from 250. It created a new federal pilot records database so airlines could see a pilot's full history before hiring them. It replaced outdated rest rules with science-based fatigue regulations built around circadian rhythms and time zones crossed, not just simple clock hours. The families of Flight 3407 called themselves the family we never wanted. But they never let go. After February 12, 2009, the U.S. didn't have another fatal commercial airline crash for nearly 16 years. 16 years. Approximately 8 billion passengers carried without a single fatal crash. And globally, the trend was moving the same direction. The last fatal passenger jet airliner accident worldwide before the 2017 record was November 28, 2016, an Avro RJ-85 carrying the Chapecoense football team that crashed near Medellin, Colombia, killing 71 people. After that, silence. 398 consecutive days without a passenger jet accident. A record. The streak held all the way through December 31st, 2017. But here's something that rarely makes the news. 0 deaths doesn't mean 0 close calls. Aviation safety experts were careful, almost cautious, in how they talked about 2017. Adrian Young, the lead analyst at TOW 70 who crunched the numbers, said something quietly alarming. It is unlikely that this historic low will be maintained. In part, these very positive figures rest on good fortune. Good fortune, not just engineering, not just training, luck too. There were turboprop accidents in 2017. Cargo planes went down. 44 people died on non-passenger jet aircraft. The number that became famous, 0, was real, but it was specific. It applied to large commercial passenger jets. Everything surrounding it was still imperfect, still dangerous, still human. Bitches in the sales arrive at the fault Polyminas about mer gratitreistemers. Hakol by Richard Wakol Tiken and Vazanets. For most, Ordamai was where one why bring in a house where to bring you to oat. The human best 60 fiel rolla di the pre-p mark put in like blind was often vote the permission law. People like Young, who spend their careers counting and categorizing aviation deaths, could see what general headlines couldn't. That 0 deaths in passenger jets almost certainly meant a year where dozens of incidents were caught just in time, where a warning system fired at the right second, a pilot caught a developing problem, a controller noticed something off. The margin, you can reasonably infer, was smaller than the headline suggested. And they knew that the complacency that 0 could breed, that quiet confidence that the problem is solved, was itself one of the most dangerous forces in aviation. Here's the question that stays with you after you understand all of this. Why does it take a disaster to create the conditions for a miracle? The rules that made 2017 possible were written in the aftermath of 1972 and 1975 and 1986 and 2009. Every one of those years has a body count attached to it. Every warning system in the cockpit of every plane you've ever flown was born from an accident where that warning system didn't exist. The database that now tracks a pilot's entire safety history was built because, before 2010, airlines were hiring people without it, and people died. Progress in aviation safety isn't linear, it's punctuated. Long stretches of slow improvement, then a catastrophe, then a surge of reform, then a new baseline of safety that everyone forgets was ever a battle. The families of Flight 3407 are still fighting, by the way. Regional airlines have repeatedly pushed to roll back pilot training requirements since 2010. Nearly 100,000 pilots signed petitions opposing that rollback. The families kept showing up in Washington, still carrying photographs, still saying the names. Not many people know what Flight 3407 is, John Kausner, whose 24-year-old daughter Ellie was killed, said years after the crash. And our job is to make sure we keep our loved ones and the fight for airline safety at the forefront. Ellie Kausner was 24 years old. She died on a routine regional flight, and in some meaningful, traceable, documented way, her death is part of why 2017 happened, why that number came up 0, why a year went by without a single passenger jet fatality anywhere on Earth. The day nobody died wasn't luck. It wasn't inevitable. It wasn't handed down by some invisible hand of progress. We're basing Narigor Workins,